I didn't come here to destroy your life, Brandon. I came because you've been destroying mine without even blinking. Those words left my lips like I'd fired a gun. And in the echo that filled our Manhattan apartment, I saw something flicker in my husband's eyes. Not guilt, not sorrow, but fear. I'm Jessica Miller, 35, financial controller for a high-stakes tech firm on Madison Avenue. The one people call when numbers don't add up, and no one else has the nerve to say so. I'm the woman who can find a missing $1 million hidden in a column of dusty spreadsheets. But somehow, I missed the secrets in my own home. The day this all started, dawn was barely creeping over the skyline. Our floor-to-ceiling windows glowed pale blue, and the city below hummed with the early grind of traffic and coffee carts. Brandon lay asleep beside me, his phone charging on the nightstand. Lately, he'd been locking it away like it was evidence in a murder trial. But that morning, he'd slipped. He left it out. And as I leaned over to grab a sweater, a notification blinked across the screen. Not just a name I didn't recognize, but a message that landed like an iron fist to my chest. Did you check if the owner knows you still have the spare key? Text me once you confirm. I'm not showing up at the cabin until I know for sure. I froze, because whoever she wasn't talking about silk lingerie or romantic wine. She was talking about a plan that involved my husband and a cabin I'd never heard of. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. Brandon's late-night strategy meetings, his sudden obsession with privacy, that look in his eyes whenever he thought I wasn't watching like a man calculating an exit. I felt the cold settle into my bones. Because this wasn't just about sex. This was about another life being built behind my back. Brick by brick, lie by lie. And as I stood there staring at that glowing screen, one truth became violently clear. I had no idea who my husband really was. But by the time the sun rose, I intended to find out. Sometimes I think numbers saved me from drowning. In a world where people lie, numbers tell the truth. Every single time. My name's Jessica Miller, 35. I'm the financial controller for ZephyrNet Solutions, a tech firm where billion-dollar valuations swing like mood swings. By day, I'm known for spotting discrepancies that could sink entire IPOs. By night, I used to believe I was the kind of wife who could hold together a life built on loyalty and mutual respect. I grew up in a small town outside Syracuse, small enough that secrets didn't stay hidden for long. Maybe that's why I thought I'd always see betrayal coming. But betrayal has a talent for moving in silence. Brandon Miller, my husband, is 38. He works as a marketing director at an innovative digital agency. People talk about his easy charisma, the way he remembers tiny details about people's lives, how he orders the perfect bottle of Barolo without looking at the wine list. He's not movie star handsome, he's real-world handsome, a guy you'd trust to help jump your car battery or carry your grandmother's groceries. But even real-world handsome can carry shadows behind his smile. In the past year, Brandon's job had been shaky. His company lost a major account, and rumor had it there were layoffs brewing. He brushed it off, calling it industry volatility, but the tension sat in his shoulders, and sometimes in the space between us at the dinner table. Then there's Sophie Carter, 39, an HR consultant whose reputation around Manhattan is a mix of brilliance and intensity. She's one of those women who seems to know everyone, always immaculately put together, a perfect blazer, a quick wit, sharp enough to slice paper. People admire her but keep a slight distance, as if they sense there's more brewing beneath the surface than she lets on. I'd known Sophie years ago at Columbia. We weren't best friends, but we were friendly enough to trade study notes and share coffee breaks. Looking back, I wonder what I missed in those glances she sometimes held a little too long. Eric Carter, her husband, is 42. He's a site supervisor for a sustainable architecture firm. He's got sun-weathered skin and a quiet presence, the kind of guy who'll listen all the way through before speaking. But he also strikes me as a man who, once betrayed, would rather burn a bridge to the ground than cross it again. Manhattan glitters with steel and glass, but there are shadows in the spaces between skyscrapers. The same shadows I started noticing in my own marriage. Little things. Brandon's nervous laugh when I asked casual questions. Sophie's name appearing on his call log late at night. A sudden chill in the air when I entered a room. I used to believe secrets couldn't survive in New York, but the truth is, in this city, secrets don't just survive, they thrive. If there's one thing finance has taught me, it's that no discrepancy is ever random. Somewhere there's always a trail. And for months, Brandon had been leaving trails, even when he thought he was being careful. It started as small things. A change in his cologne, something woodsy and darker than the crisp citrus scent he'd worn for years. New shirts, slim-fit, expensive labels. An unexpected interest in meditation apps and podcasts about mindfulness. None of that was a crime, but it wasn't him. Then came the phone habits. Brandon used to toss his phone anywhere, left it on countertops, the coffee table, the bed. But one night, I heard the click of a lock screen slamming shut as I walked into the kitchen. I looked up and he was staring at me, face pale, jaw tight. He muttered something about work stress. I tried to believe him, but the next day, his phone stayed glued to his hip like an extra limb. Even when he showered, it sat propped on the bathroom shelf screen, turned away from me. The distance between us widened, measured not in feet, but in unspoken words. At dinner, he'd scroll through his phone, grinning at texts I never saw. When I asked what was so funny, he'd shrug and say, "Just work memes." Work memes don't usually make people blush. I noticed his expense reports started shifting too. Brandon was never reckless with money, but suddenly there were Uber charges at strange hours, from neighborhoods that had no connection to either of our offices. One receipt in particular stuck with me, a trip from Midtown to Greenpoint at 11:38 p.m. on a Tuesday. When I asked him about it, he claimed he'd dropped off a colleague after a late pitch meeting, but he couldn't tell me the colleague's name or why a single drop-off required a 20-minute detour. I caught him changing his email password. I pretended not to notice, but inside my stomach turned over like a flipped coin, because Brandon used to share everything with me. He used to show me campaign drafts, even his dumb memes. He used to trust me with the messiest parts of his life. Now he was locking me out. It wasn't only Brandon who changed. I started seeing Sophie's name everywhere. At first, it was an occasional call on his cell, then texts at odd hours. One night, he accidentally left his phone on the sofa, and the screen flashed. "Sophie, do you still have the cabin key? Let me know before Saturday." A cabin key. Saturday. Suddenly, everything shifted. I remembered Sophie from college. Charming, intense. A woman who wanted life on her own terms. I hadn't spoken to her in years, so why was she now texting my husband about cabins and spare keys? I tried convincing myself it was innocent. Business, a consulting project, anything but what my gut was screaming. But the lies kept stacking up like dominoes. Brandon began coming home later, smelled like wine I didn't recognize, and some nights, he slipped into bed beside me without so much as touching my hand. The silence between us felt alive, buzzing, heavy. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of traffic 12 stories below, and wondering who he was thinking about, who he might be texting, and why I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. Because the man beside me was starting to look less and less like my husband, and more like a man rehearsing his escape. The morning it all finally broke open started off so ordinary. You'd never know it was the day my marriage would split at the seams. It was barely 6:30, and the sky outside our windows was the color of cold steel. Brandon was in the shower. Steam rolled over the glass, blurring his silhouette into soft, shifting shapes. I stood at the sink, brushing my teeth, eyes heavy from another night of restless sleep. And that's when I heard it. A buzz. Soft. Insistent. Brandon's phone left on the marble countertop, a slip he'd been too tired to avoid. It lit up glowing in the gloom like a lighthouse beacon. I tried to look away, but my eyes snapped toward it before my mind could stop them. On the screen, a message preview sat stark and unmistakable. "Sophie, did you check if the owner knows you still have the spare key? Text me once you confirm. I'm not showing up at the cabin until I know for sure." A single ordinary notification, but it may as well have been a grenade, because that one text shattered any last thread of denial I'd been gripping. This wasn't flirtation. This wasn't a work friendship. This was planning. Strategic. Secretive. Cold. I stood there, toothbrush dangling from my hand, toothpaste foam dissolving into the sink. 1,000 puzzle pieces clicked into place in my mind. Brandon's late nights, the cryptic Ubers, the way he'd recoil when I asked innocent questions. And now Sophie, someone from my past, appearing in my present like a ghost who'd decided to rewrite my story. My first thought was that Brandon was taking her to a place he and I had shared. But the cabin she mentioned, I'd never even heard of it. Suddenly, the possibility opened up that there was an entire corner of his life I'd never glimpsed, rooms I hadn't entered, promises I'd never been given. I felt my throat tighten as I remembered the years I'd spent building trust brick by brick. While he'd been digging tunnels underneath it, I didn't touch his phone. I didn't swipe it open. I didn't have to, because everything I needed to know was already there, pulsing on that screen. Brandon stepped out of the shower towel, slung around his waist, hair wet and dripping. He flashed me a grin that used to melt me, but today it just made me cold. "Morning," he said, voice casual. "You okay?" I forced my lips into something resembling a smile. "Yeah, fine." My voice sounded distant even to my own ears. He didn't notice. He leaned in, pressed a quick kiss to my temple, then disappeared into the closet to get dressed. As soon as he was gone, I grabbed my phone. I pulled up my browser, typed the words Sophie Carter, New York. Her professional photo popped up almost instantly, polished, poised, that same confident half smile I remembered from college. HR consultant, client list full of names big enough to fill a skyscraper's lobby directory. And then, am married to Eric Carter. I clicked on Eric's LinkedIn next. Site supervisor, sustainable architecture. A man who spent his days pouring concrete and planning skylines. And I wondered if he had any idea that the woman he shared his bed with was plotting cabin weekends with my husband. That was the second my mind shifted gears, because this wasn't just about me anymore. Someone else was walking around in the same darkness, blind to what was happening behind his back. And I wasn't about to let him stay blind for long. By the time I left the apartment that morning, my skin felt like paper. Every noise seemed too loud. The subway screeched against the rails like it was trying to peel open my skull. I kept replaying that message in my mind, Sophie asking about the spare key, as if it was perfectly normal for my husband to hold on to keys for a cabin I'd never been invited to. At my office, the glow of my dual monitors made my eyes ache. Numbers blurred into meaningless strings. Profit margins, variance reports, market volatility graphs. I'd spent my entire adult life being the person who could find missing decimals in a $12 million balance sheet. But right now, I couldn't even locate my own heartbeat. My phone sat on my desk like a live bomb. Every few minutes, I'd pick it up, then set it down again. My thumb hovered over Sophie's contact. I thought about texting her directly, but I knew how that conversation would go. Lies, deflection, 1,000 excuses. No, if I wanted the truth, I had to talk to the one other person who deserved to know it. Eric Carter. I searched his number on his architecture firm's website. It took me less than 60 seconds to find his office extension. But staring at those digits, my stomach twisted so hard, I thought I might be sick. I'd never even met him. Did I have the right to drop a bomb like this on a stranger? But then I pictured Sophie's message again, and Brandon's fake smile as he kissed my cheek that morning. I wasn't the one detonating anything. They already had. I just refused to keep quiet while they pretended nothing was burning. So I typed the message, "Hi, Eric. I know we've never met. This is Jessica Miller. I believe your wife Sophie and my husband Brandon are involved in something. And I thought you should know." I read it back to myself 5 times. It felt clinical, cold. I deleted it, tried again. "I'm so sorry to be the one telling you this, but I think Sophie and Brandon are seeing each other. If you're willing to talk, I have proof." My hands were shaking so hard that I hit send without realizing it. The moment the screen blinked, delivered, my whole body slumped forward over the keyboard. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20, nothing. I was about to convince myself he'd block me as some deranged stranger when my phone buzzed. A single reply. "Who are you? What proof do you have?" My breath caught. I typed back. "I have screenshots, messages, times, dates, a cabin they're planning to meet at. Please, let me show you." A pause. Then Eric wrote, "Call me." I stared at my screen, then gathered every ounce of courage I had left and pressed the green button, because I wasn't just saving myself anymore. I was about to help another person see the truth. Eric Carter's voice over the phone was deep calm, but carrying an undercurrent like a fault line, waiting to crack. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me of making it up. He just said, "Where can we meet?" We chose a coffee shop in Hell's Kitchen, someplace neutral, someplace public enough that if one of us decided to flip a table, there'd be witnesses. I got there early, grabbed a corner seat near the window. My hands shook so badly I nearly spilled my coffee. I kept checking the door, half expecting Eric to barge in furious. But when he arrived, he was almost quiet. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered leather jacket and scuffed work boots. He looked like someone who fixed things for a living, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a man who just realized the ground under his feet might not be as solid as he thought. He sat across from me and didn't bother with small talk. "Show me." I passed him my phone. Screenshots. Texts between Brandon and Sophie. The spare key. Mentions of a cabin. Dates that lined up exactly with the nights Brandon told me he was working late. Eric scrolled in silence. His thumb hovered over a photo of Brandon's contact name next to Sophie's. He didn't look up for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was rough. "She told me she was in Philly on business those weekends." I swallowed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt you." He let out a humorless laugh. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything." "They did." He set the phone down, folded his hands on the table. "Here's the thing. I'm not the type to blow up someone's life without evidence. And I don't believe in screaming matches. I believe in facts." My chest tightened. "That's why I wanted to show you. I'm not looking for revenge. I want them to see us, to look us in the eye and admit it." Eric nodded slowly. He rubbed his jaw as if trying to scrub the situation off his face. "There's something you should know," he said. "The cabin, it was mine once. Before Sophie and I even got married. I sold it to an old friend when we needed the cash, but I kept a spare key, just in case." I blinked. "You kept a key?" For a cabin you don't even own." He shrugged, eyes tired. "It was sentimental. I built half the deck myself. It was supposed to be our place. But after a while, Sophie didn't like going anymore." He exhaled, steadying his voice. "So here's what I'm thinking. We go up there. We get inside first. We wait for them. No yelling, no fighting. Just let them see that the gig's up." I stared at him. "You're sure you can handle that?" Eric's jaw tightened. "I don't want to punch your husband if that's what you're asking. But I'm done being lied to." A faint smile tugged at my lips despite everything. "That makes two of us." Outside the window, rain began to fall. Eric picked up his coffee, stared into it like he was seeing something far away. Then he looked back at me, eyes steady. "We're going to make them tell the truth, whether they want to or not." And in that moment, two strangers who should never have met became partners in the one thing we both needed most: closure. A few days later, I was packing a small overnight bag for the trip to the cabin when my phone buzzed. It was Eric. "We need to talk before we go up there." His voice, when I called him back, was hesitant, careful. "There's something I didn't tell you at the cafe," he said. My chest tightened. "Okay, what?" Eric let out a slow exhale. "Sophie didn't just randomly reconnect with Brandon. She's always had some connection to you. Even before all this." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Eric hesitated again. "Last year, Sophie and I went through a rough patch. She started opening up about things from her past. She told me, back in college, she used to have feelings for someone, a woman, and Jess, that person was you." My mind went blank for a second. That's ridiculous. Sophie and I barely knew each other at Columbia." Eric's voice was soft but certain. "That's not how she remembers it. She said you were the only person who made her feel truly understood. She said you were confident, unapologetic, like you had this clarity about who you were. And she admired that." I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, my overnight bag falling over onto the floor. Little flashes flickered through my memory. Late nights in Butler Library, Sophie leaning closer than necessary when we whispered about midterms. Her laugh a little too loud sometimes. The day she showed up at my dorm door with a birthday cupcake and a tiny silver bookmark engraved with my initials. I'd thought she was just friendly. I swallowed hard. But why Brandon? Why go after my husband? Eric sounded exhausted. "I think maybe part of her wanted to be connected to you again. Even if it was twisted. Even if it was sideways." I pressed a hand to my forehead, trying to make sense of it. So this whole affair might not have just been about Brandon at all. Eric let out a hollow laugh. "Apparently, I'm not the only one who thought my marriage was about one thing, when it was really about something else." I stared at the floor, the wood grain swimming in my vision. All this time, I'd been convinced the betrayal was only physical, but now it felt so much more tangled. Sophie hadn't just stolen my husband, she'd stolen fragments of my past, my sense of safety, my certainty about the boundaries between friendship and something more. I spoke softly. "I don't even know what to feel about that." Eric's voice gentled. "Feel whatever you need to, but don't let it distract you. Tomorrow, we're going to get the truth. All of it." Outside my window, Manhattan pulsed with light and noise, but inside my chest, there was only the quiet thud of a heart trying to figure out what was real and what had always been a lie. The drive north felt like the road was stretching on purpose, testing how long we could hold ourselves together before the truth shattered everything. Eric barely spoke. One hand rested on the steering wheel, the other clenched on his thigh, his knuckles white. The further we left the city behind, the quieter the world grew, until it was just trees and gray sky and the low growl of his truck. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, the cabin looked small against the towering pines. Dark wood, tall windows catching slivers of a pale winter sun. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind rustling the branches, and tried to remember how it felt to be a woman who trusted the man she loved. Inside, the place was neat. A stone fireplace sat empty, leather armchairs, a table set for 4, as though waiting for a dinner party that would never happen. Eric flipped on the lights, casting soft gold across the beams overhead. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Eric quietly said, "Help me set this up." We opened the bottle of Pinot Noir I'd brought, Sophie's favorite, and poured 4 glasses. Eric found a folded blanket and draped it over the back of the couch. I placed a small stack of printed photos in the center of the table, screenshots, bank transfers, text conversations, evidence, not to humiliate them, but because we knew the first words out of their mouths would be, "This isn't what you think." We sat down across from each other. Eric's eyes were glassy, but his voice was steady. Once they come through that door, there's no going back. I nodded, though my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. "I'm ready." Time crawled. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. I checked my phone every 30 seconds. Then, headlights slashed through the trees outside. Eric and I exchanged a single silent glance. The car doors slammed. Muffled laughter filtered through the crisp air. Then the sound of footsteps climbing the porch. The cabin door swung open, and Sophie stepped inside mid-laugh. She froze so suddenly that Brandon nearly collided with her back. They both stared at us, eyes wide like animals caught in a trap. Brandon's voice came out first, rough and disbelieving. "Jess, what the hell?" I didn't stand up. I kept my voice calm. "Close the door. Sit down." Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but Eric cut her off. "Sit down." Slowly they obeyed. Brandon dropped into a chair, avoiding my eyes. Sophie hovered behind him, arms wrapped tight around herself. The silence stretched like a wire between us. Finally, I leaned forward, my palms flat on the table. "I'm not here to scream. I'm not here to throw things. I'm here because the two of you have been living in a fantasy, and we're done letting you." Brandon tried to speak, but I held up a hand. "No, you've done enough talking behind closed doors. Now it's our turn." I nudged the pile of photos toward him. "Go ahead, tell me these are fake." Brandon swallowed. Sophie's breath came in shallow gasps. Eric's voice was low and measured. "You planned this cabin weekend. You lied to both of us. You used the same excuses, the same words. And we've got the receipts." Sophie blinked, trembling. "It wasn't supposed to. It wasn't meant to go this far." Her voice was small. Eric looked at her, his expression unreadable. Funny, affairs rarely do. Until they do. Brandon finally lifted his eyes to mine. "Jess, please. You have to believe me. It didn't mean anything. It was just a mistake. A few times, I was feeling lost. Work's been hell. I didn't know how to tell you how scared I've been about getting fired, about failing you." His words poured out in a rush. I stared at him, feeling strangely hollow. "Then you should have talked to me, not her." Sophie stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Jess, I never wanted to hurt you. I thought maybe Brandon understood me in ways Eric didn't. And I'm sorry." I scoffed softly. "Understood you or reminded you of me?" Sophie flinched. Eric turned to her, his jaw clenched. "Was any of it real, Soph? Or was it all just some twisted way of staying close to Jess?" She tried to reach for his hand. He pulled back. Sophie whispered, "Eric, I made mistakes, but I still love you." Eric let out a breath that sounded like it scraped his chest raw. "I'm not sure that matters anymore." Brandon leaned forward, his eyes desperate. "Jess, I swear I'd end it, right here, right now. I love you. I was drowning." My voice came out softer than I expected. And so you reached for a lifeline that didn't belong to you. He lowered his head. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, making the cabin creak. For a moment, no one said anything. Then I spoke, my voice steady. I'm not here for revenge. I'm not here to beg for explanations. I'm here because I refuse to live in a story written by your lies. Sophie began to cry silently. Eric looked utterly exhausted. Brandon looked small, and I realized in that moment I wasn't trapped anymore. I was free. The cabin had fallen so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of Eric's watch, one from across the table. Brandon sat hunched, staring into his empty wine glass, like it might tell him what to say next. Sophie dabbed her eyes, her fingers trembling. Eric was rigid, arms crossed over his chest, gaze locked on a knot in the wooden tabletop. I thought we'd finally said it all. I thought there couldn't possibly be another twist left. But then Sophie lifted her face, and the look in her eyes made my stomach clench before she even spoke. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. There's one more thing. Eric didn't look at her. Don't, he said. Don't try to spin this. We've heard enough. But Sophie shook her head, her lower lip trembling. It's not spin. It's the truth. She swallowed hard, as though trying to steady her breath. I'm pregnant. The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending silent ripples through all four of us. Eric blinked slowly, turning his head toward her. Brandon sat bolt upright, his eyes widening. What, he rasped. Sophie nodded, tears gathering again. I found out 2 weeks ago. I wasn't sure how to. I didn't know when to say it. I thought, maybe this weekend at the cabin. Eric's voice was raw. Is it mine? Sophie hesitated. The silence stretched so long that the logs in the fireplace seemed to crack louder, even though no fire was lit. Then she whispered, Yes, it's yours, I'm sure. Brandon let out a ragged breath, his hand flying up to rub his forehead. Jesus Christ. Sophie, are you kidding me? You told me you were on birth control. She closed her eyes, shaking her head. I was, but things happen. And it's not yours, Brandon. We were careful. It's Eric's. Eric sat back in his chair, staring at nothing. He whispered almost to himself, You lied to me. For how long? Sophie's voice cracked. I didn't want you to hate me. I was scared. I thought maybe Brandon was the answer. Maybe I wanted something new. But the baby, that's not a maybe. That's real. Eric's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. And what, Sophie, you were going to raise it with me while sneaking off to cabins with her husband. She tried to reach for his hand, but he recoiled slightly. Eric, I swear I didn't plan this. I was lost. I was angry, but I want our child. And I want us if there's any way to save us. Brandon's laugh was low, bitter. This is insane. I thought we were having fun. I thought we were two people blowing off steam. And now there's a baby. I looked at him, my voice ice. Fun, you were burning down 2 marriages for fun. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sophie wiped her eyes again. I know I've ruined everything, but this baby didn't ask for any of it. Eric stared at her jaw tight. And what do you expect me to do now? Sophie, just pretend this didn't happen. She shook her head. No, I don't expect you to pretend. I want to be honest from here on, for the baby's sake. Eric's face hardened, his voice low. For the baby's sake, I'll be there. But for you and me, I don't know, Soph. I don't know anymore. Brandon pushed back his chair abruptly and stood pacing the room, one hand dragging through his hair. Jess, please, I know this looks terrible, but you and I can still fix us. We don't have kids. We could start fresh. I stared at him, disbelief searing through my chest. Start fresh with you, after this. He tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, because the truth had finally become undeniable. Brandon wasn't just a man who'd cheated. He was a man who wanted me to erase reality so he could keep living his lie. And I wasn't that woman anymore. Not for him. Not for anyone. Brandon stood there, his chest heaving, eyes rimmed red, as though trying to summon the right words to fix the unfixable. Sophie had slumped into the chair beside Eric, shoulders shaking as silent tears dripped onto her palms. Eric sat, rigid arms folded, staring at a dark spot on the cabin floor, like he might burn a hole straight through the wood. The silence in the room was enormous, like all four of us were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to decide whether to jump or walk away. Brandon finally broke the stillness. "Jess, listen to me. Don't let this be the end. We've built a life together, you and me. That has to mean something." I felt a dull ache pulse behind my eyes, because once upon a time, he'd been right. But now, all the memories we'd built felt like a house with dry rot, ready to collapse under its own weight. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying since we left Manhattan. Brandon's eyes followed it as I set it on the table. "What's that?" he asked, voice cracking. "My freedom," I said quietly. He blinked. "Don't talk like that. Jess, please. We can see a counselor. We can figure this out. I'll leave Sophie behind for good. I'll prove it to you." I shook my head slow and steady. "Brandon, you don't get it. This isn't just about Sophie or the affair. It's about who you've become. The secrets, the half-truths, the way you kept looking at me like I was an obstacle, not your wife." His eyes glistened. "I'm sorry, I messed up. But it doesn't mean we have to throw everything away." I felt something cold and final settle into my chest. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm letting go of something that's already gone. I flipped open the folder, papers inside crisp and white, typed names, dollar figures, divisions of assets down to the last decimal. "This is our divorce filing," I said. "I've already signed my side. The lawyers have copies. I'm not out to ruin you financially. I just want to end this with as little blood as possible." Brandon swallowed hard. "So that's it." I met his eyes. "Yes, that's it." He tried again, a last desperate reach. "I love you, Jess." I almost laughed, though it came out as a bitter puff of air. "You love the way I made your life look put together. You love having someone to come home to, so you can feel like the good guy. But you didn't love me enough to keep your promises." Brandon sat down heavily, like the air had left his lungs. Eric shifted beside Sophie, clearing his throat. "For what it's worth, Jess, I respect the hell out of you." I gave him a small nod. "Thanks, Eric. I respect you too, even if I wish we'd met under better circumstances." Brandon opened his mouth one last time, but I didn't wait to hear it. I closed the folder, tucked it under my arm, and picked up my bag. Then I looked at Brandon, the man I'd once imagined growing old beside, and said softly, "I hope you find whatever it is you've been chasing. But I'm not going to keep losing myself while you keep searching." And with that, I walked out of the cabin, into a night so clear and cold it felt like I'd been reborn. The weeks after the cabin felt like moving through fog. Paperwork, lawyer meetings, late nights lying awake listening to the muted roar of the city outside my window, wondering how long it would take for my chest to stop feeling hollow. But as the days passed, something else crept in too. Relief, because for the first time in years, I wasn't pretending anymore. I didn't have to wonder what secrets were waiting in my husband's inbox, or who he was texting when he turned away from me in bed. I was alone, but I was free. One morning, I sat at my kitchen table, coffee steaming in front of me, staring at a spreadsheet on my laptop. Not for work. For me, I'd started running numbers. Divorce settlements, tax implications, asset splits, retirement fund rollovers. The financial fallout of betrayal was brutal. I knew that better than anyone. But as I stared at those numbers, it hit me. I could help other women navigate this mess. Women who'd been blindsided like me, left trying to figure out how to keep the lights on while their ex was off playing house with someone new. So I built something new, Miller Financial Resilience Group, a boutique consulting practice focused on helping women protect themselves during and after divorce. I started small, referrals from friends, quiet meetings in coffee shops, late-night phone calls with women who whispered into the phone like they were confessing sins, terrified they'd lose everything. I showed them how to trace hidden accounts, how to build emergency savings, how to split pensions and retirement plans so they didn't end up starting from zero. Every time one of them left my office standing a little taller, a little less afraid, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. Because the truth is, money can't heal a broken heart, but it can give you choices. And after everything I'd lost, helping other women keep their choices felt like the best kind of revenge. But rebuilding my life wasn't just about spreadsheets and bank accounts. There was another dream, one I'd buried so deep I almost forgot it was there. Long before finance, before suits and conference calls, I'd wanted to own a little bookshop cafe, a place where people could sit for hours, wrapped in the smell of roasted coffee beans and turning pages, where no one was in a hurry and everyone felt welcome. Brandon used to roll his eyes whenever I mentioned it. He'd say, "It's cute, Jess, but it's not practical. Manhattan rents would eat you alive." But now, Brandon's voice wasn't in my life anymore. So one crisp Saturday morning, I drove north along the Hudson River windows down Music Low. In a small riverside town, I passed an empty storefront with tall glass windows and a faded for-lease sign taped to the door. Something inside me sparked. 2 months later, Harbor Light Books and Brew opened its doors. Hardwood floors, second-hand armchairs, rows of shelves crammed with everything from thrillers to poetry. I learned to steam milk into perfect rosettas. I stocked the pastry case with cinnamon scones and blueberry muffins. Locals started dropping in first out of curiosity, then out of habit. I'd watch people come in looking tired and leave smiling, a book tucked under their arm. Sometimes I'd catch couples lingering over coffee, leaning close, whispering secrets. And for a moment, it would hit me how far I'd come. I didn't have to measure my worth in someone else's eyes anymore. I'd built something of my own, something real. And every time I flipped the sign to open, I knew I'd finally stepped into a life that felt like mine. Sometimes in the quiet hour before my shop opens, I sit by the front window with a mug of coffee warm in my hands, and I think about how different my life used to look. There was a time I believed love alone was enough to hold everything together, that as long as I worked hard, stayed loyal, forgave easily, things would turn out the way I'd dreamed. But life has a way of shaking you awake. I learned that trust isn't something you can keep alive by sheer will. It either exists or it doesn't, and once it's gone, you can pretend for a while, but deep down you know the truth. I've learned that sometimes the people who say they love you aren't strong enough to love you well. And that's not always about malice. Sometimes it's about fear or insecurity or wounds they refuse to admit. But none of that excuses the harm they cause when they lie, or the way they make you question your own instincts. For a long time, I thought walking away would mean I'd failed my marriage, failed myself. But I know better now. Leaving wasn't failure. It was choosing myself. It was refusing to keep shrinking to fit into a life that had become too small. People sometimes ask me if I'd go back and change things, if I wish I'd caught the lies sooner, if I wish I'd been less forgiving or more forgiving. But the truth is, I don't wish any of it away, because it led me here. To mornings filled with the smell of coffee and paper, to clients who walk into my office terrified and walk out a little braver, to evenings where I can sit in silence and feel peaceful instead of lonely. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Your worth isn't tied to anyone else's loyalty. You're not obligated to stay where your spirit is dying, just because you once promised you would. And the end of something might be the beginning of the best thing you've ever built. Have you ever found yourself standing on the edge, trying to decide whether to stay or walk away? And if you did, what did you discover about yourself on the other side?